many artists from throughout the globe to be in conversation with other cultural leaders. In the past, we've welcomed artists with musical backgrounds such as Flea to be in conversation with visual artist Thomas Hausago or Robert Longo, the visual artist represented in the Broad collection, with Henry Rollins. And tonight we have Yuval Sharon, the great director of, the artistic director of the industry, in conversation with the visual artists Neo Rauch and Rosa Loy, speaking about their collaboration on Lohengrin this summer in the Bayreuth Festival in Germany. And tonight's conversation is going to be moderated by Broad curator Ed Schad. And one of the things that's quite interesting about the conversation this evening is that we're going to play the third act of the opera, because we're assuming many of you have not seen the opera, being that it was produced in Germany while they're talking. So just know that they will be sometimes referencing what you're seeing behind them. For those of you who do speak German, it is subtitled, but in German. So you will have an advantage. I'm very proud to introduce Yuval Sharon, who is the founder and artistic director of the Industry, which is LA's experimental opera company. Sharon and the industry have been playing a transformative role in our cultural fabric here and also revolutionizing the field of opera. In recognition of his work, the New York Times called Sharon a disruptor in residence, and he is the recipient of a MacArthur Genius Award. Sharon is currently a 3-year resident at the LA Philharmonic, where he's incubating and presenting new work. Some of you may have seen some of those works. In fact, he has cage operas performing right now at Culver City, in the Sony Studios at Culver City. And there may be a few tickets left for that. I'm not sure of that. Beyond LA, Sharon has been directing operatic works in San Francisco, in Vienna, Berlin, and Cleveland. And I have to just share that working with Yuval, he is one of the most pleasant and lovely human beings to partner with in our field. And I'm thrilled that he's here in Los Angeles and doing such incredible work. Neo Rauch's paintings have been on view at the Broad consistently since the museum opened its doors over 3 years ago. Currently, his paintings Der Laden and Fundgrube are on view in the exhibition downstairs on the first floor entitled A Journey That Wasn't. Rauch was raised in a communist East Germany, and when Germany unified in the 1990s, Rauch assimilated and kind of both parodied and assimilated the social realist aesthetics of communism with the popular imagery of capitalism in his paintings. And the unique styles of both Rauch and also Rosa Loy have been instrumental in kind of giving rise to a new generation of painters in the Leipzig area called the New Leipzig School of German Painting. They are leaders in their field, and they are two artists who are keeping painting really vibrant and contemporary for a new audience. Painter Rosa Loy is currently featured in a solo exhibition at the Cone Gallery in Hollywood, and it's opening tomorrow night. And I encourage you all to go there and see it over the next weekend and few weeks. She has been exhibited widely throughout Germany and Los Angeles and New York, and like Rauch, Loy's paintings reference her upbringing in Leipzig during communism. She paints with cassine, which she applies to canvases to add texture and meaning to the feminine figures. All of the figures in her paintings are feminine. And in her dreamlike tableaus that include elements of German fairy tales, German history, Freudian eroticism, and authoritarian rule. Tonight's moderator for the conversation is my colleague Ed Schad, and Schad was the Broad's curator for the Jasper Johns exhibition, Something Resembling Truth. Many of you may have seen that last winter here at the Broad, and also for the current exhibition downstairs on the first floor that features Neo's work called A Journey That Wasn't. And he'll be also curating the first West Coast solo exhibition of the artist Sharon Shirin Nishat. It's entitled "I Will Greet the Sun Again." Shirin is Iranian-born artist who was exiled here to the United States, to Southern California actually, and has been making work about the experience of refugees and about the experience of women in Iran since then. And some of you may have seen some of her video work here at the Broad previously. So with that, I want to ask you all to join me in welcoming our speakers to the stage.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Ed. Thank you, Ed Patuto, for that great introduction. Great. Let's get started. As you see, the opera, the third act, is playing behind us of Lohengrin. First, just a brief introduction to why we're here. The Bayreuth Festival is the #1 central important presentation of Richard Wagner's work in the world. It occurs every year in July and August. The great collaborators that are joining me this evening have directed Lohengrin, which, God willing, will play for the next 5 years at the festival. I've been getting to know them and the opera over the past couple of days, and it's very overwhelming to think about the amount of history and the amount of importance that is attached to this festival. Yet, one of the things that's really stepped forward is that y'all are having an extraordinary amount of fun. The three of you get along extraordinarily well. It's been fun to see you banter about your experiences, almost as though you've been through a great battle, or that you are comrades in arms. So I wanted to start because there's a long arc to the story of this opera and how it came to be. And I wanted to start with Rosa and Neo about how you got involved in this project, the origin of it.
Yeah, I received a very unexpected phone call by Katharina Wagner, and she asked me if I would be able to do the stage for Lohengrin, and that was almost 6 years ago. And I said, yes, why not? Because it's a long time, and in situations like this, when you are confronted with such long time distances, you are not very serious often, because I didn't expect how many nightmares and sleepless nights that will bring into my life this issue. Yeah, 6 years ago.
Yeah, 6 years ago.
More than 6 years ago.
And Yuval, you joined more recently than 6 years.
It was, I think it was October 2016 that I joined. And when I first met Neo and Rosa. So they were already fairly far along in the development of what they wanted to create when I came on board, which is unusual for directors. I think a lot of people think that directors always start from the ground up and everything comes from only their vision. But actually that's a perception that I've been wanting to really challenge in the opera world generally, is the idea that opera, what makes opera so exciting is that it's the ultimate collaborative art form, the ultimate multimedia art form. It's the place where all of the different arts intersect. And it's not purely this outgrowth of one person's imagination, but instead the place of lots of people's individual artistry and the back and forth between all of that artistry that makes it so exciting. And the tensions that arise, but then also these unexpected felicities that come out of it. So this felt like a new challenge for me to say, okay, I'm not there at day one of this project, but how can I be responsive to the intuitive and imaginative responses of two artists whose work I admire so greatly. And they met the challenge as well with an extraordinary openness and eagerness to keep exploring. It was not like a finished set that I just had to make work, but it was more like a prompt. And from that prompt, it developed into the production that you're seeing. So it really, even though it was a late start, it still felt like it had the collaborative dialogic relationship that I think we all look for when we create a piece.
One of the things you'll notice as you're watching behind me is that there are very dominant visual motifs that drive this production. Yuval, when you encountered some of the designs upon arriving to work on the opera, what were some of the lightning rods or touchstones that were in place?
Mm-hmm. There were two very important elements in place from the very beginning. The first was the dominance of the color blue. And at the very first time I met Neo and Rosa, it was at their studio in Leipzig, and I feel like that was just the moment where you guys made that decision. Or it was shortly thereafter, because there were some elements already on a kind of a stage model, but it was early because you had this enthusiasm about this this idea of everything being blue and white as opposed to black and white, or the kind of monochrome feeling. And I found that very exciting. First of all, because I knew it would be aesthetically pleasing, but there was an aspect about it that I loved in relation to Lohengrin, which is that sense of a kind of a fairy tale universe, that it doesn't take place in our everyday reality, but lives somewhere new and somewhere different. And maybe also someplace that relies on a kind of old-fashioned view of the world, a kind of Delft China perspective. And that artificiality actually might help us bring the ideas of Lohengrin to a more concrete position from there. So that was one key element, and the other key element was one very unexpected scenic element, namely this power station that was at the center of what is otherwise looks like it could be a kind of 17th century Dutch painting. And that disconnect between this power station, something very 20th century, and what has otherwise felt like a 17th century world, I found that really fascinating, and I think that felt to me like a good opening to keep exploring how that could evolve over the production.
Neo and Rosa, would you mind talking about the evolution of the blue in the production?
Yeah. I started with some different color versions, and at the beginning I thought about to put it into a pale, rusty brown atmosphere, and but that didn't work. That didn't fit to the music, and you try to imagine that for 6 years the music is present in my studio. I was influenced by this enchanting music, and suddenly the blue came up, and I decided, yes, let's keep it in blue. Rosa was totally convinced when I told her this, and after this decision, we read about what Nietzsche said about the opera Lohengrin. He said it's blue. It's it's a totally blue opera.
Yeah, the music is blue,
Yeah.
I said. Mhm, mhm.
And so we came first, and then came Nietzsche.
And in the beginning it was really hard, and the decision to blue, it makes it really easy. It flows. It was really easy to organize it all. Every decision was very easy.
You mentioned yesterday when we spoke that you minimized your encounters with other visual representations of Lohengrin, that the music was primary. Can you talk about that decision? Or it seems that it was a very intuitive decision. Is that?
Yes, first we saw the Lohengrin from Neuenfels in Bayreuth to have an idea about the opera, the house, and then we had a video from Herzog. That's all. So these are very different operas, very different directors, and that is enough. Otherwise, your mind is so stuffed with other pictures. So we want to let our mind open for influence, for ideas, for inspirations. So that was the reason we don't like to see too much Lohengrins. We heard more the music for inspiration.
In the reviews, the opera is extraordinarily successful. The amount of attention that it has gathered, both in Germany as well as here in the New York Times and the New Yorker, for example. And the reviews seem to talk about this balance between what you've been discussing, this enchantment, this desire to re-enchant an opera that has been thoroughly deconstructed for the past 150 years. While on the other hand, the opera has been cited as being very politically forward-thinking and dynamic in the interpretation. It's wonderful that those two things could coexist. I was wondering if you might talk a little bit about that, Yuval.
Yeah, sure, because that in many ways was the experiment. For me, too, was thinking that if the aesthetic of the production is so enchanting and fairy tale, what about all of the layers of history and the complex issues that Lohengrin raises that you still need to address, and especially in Bayreuth, they need to be addressed. I don't think we could go into a kind of a Disneyland with this production. And there, of course, even with such beautiful visuals, there's the danger of making it too pretty, that everything looks really beautiful, and therefore we don't go into the depth of what's there. And from the beginning I thought, well, what about, when you think about the fairy tales, especially the Grimm fairy tales, where they do have an aura of enchantment, and underneath that aura are very, very dark urges and ideas. And in a way, they become these kind of subconscious working throughs of things that are too difficult to address directly. And so they need to sort of have the kind of aesthetic presentation of a fairy tale. And that's how you deal with things like all kinds of nasty things, violence, sexuality, or being tortured by sexuality, being uncomfortable with your own sexuality, all of these things that become, that cook under the surface of what is otherwise a very beautiful looking story that might be great for children. And then it actually turns out to be terrible for children. And when I read the Grimm stories, I always think, I cannot believe children read these things because there's such terrible things that happen to them. So I actually feel like Lohengrin kind of belongs in that world. There is an element, and there you hear in the music too, you hear this absolute lush, beautiful sense of a faraway land that feels so, so beautiful. And underneath it are incredibly complex political ideas. And so I really thought, I wonder if this aesthetic could actually be the vehicle to talk about the political undercurrents, to maybe shift the story more in the realm of Wagner's own time. When he wrote it, he was a political radical and was actually exiled shortly before the premiere of Lohengrin because he was connected to Marxist thinkers. And it's not what we often think about when we think about Wagner. We think very much right-wing, but actually in his time he was a real leftist and was after a kind of, he was at this point, at the point of Lohengrin, he was after really tearing down all of the existing political structures, which he hated so much, including the opera itself, which he had a love-hate relationship with as he was creating pieces for the opera. He didn't make it to see the premiere of Lohengrin because he had to be in exile in Switzerland because of his connection to the Dresden uprising. And so that ferment of that environment fed this piece in a very strong way, even though it has this element of lush string writing and beautiful ensembles. It's in many ways his most old-fashioned music, but it has underneath it a really progressive idea. And so I felt like it was a great opportunity to marry a fairy tale aesthetic with a progressive way of thinking that didn't have to be a sledgehammer over the audience's head, but instead could coexist as a layer among all the other layers.
Rosa and Neo, were you also thinking of fairy tales in a similar manner?
Fairy tales, in terms of this opera,
Yes.
why not? We are working on the big issue of re-enchantment of the world as painters and as stage designers. And one of my favorite sentences of the review in the New York Times was the final sentence. He wrote, the political aspect of Yuval Sharon wasn't disturbed by the romantic aspect of Rauch and Loy, and the other direction also.
Yeah. Well, I remember the last sentence actually said, and that's why there weren't so many boos.
Yeah.
That's what I remember the last sentence being. And it's true. We don't remember.
Yes, and the fairy tale, everybody knows fairy tales, and we learn to read fairy tales and the secret in fairy tales. So this is a good way to read the secret of Lohengrin, or put some secrets in, or let's see what's behind the secrets.
Well, we mentioned before we came out here that there would be a point where we got into the story of Lohengrin. Yuval, you mentioned you had a very concise way of talking about the story.
I'll try, certainly. For those that don't know the story of Lohengrin, we get introduced to the world of Brabant in the Netherlands, and the king, the German king comes. It's at that point sort of a German territory, and they all come to put Elsa to trial for the murder of her brother named Gottfried. And she says that there is someone who will fight for me, but he doesn't exist in this world. He exists in some kind of fairy tale world that I'm praying to. He'll come to my rescue. A knight in shining armor, quite literally, is the language that she uses. And lo and behold, a miracle happens, and on the lake, a swan arrives and drags this boat along, and there is a knight. We don't know the name of this knight, but he comes and says, I'll be happy to fight for you and to fight for your honor, for the reward of your hand in marriage. But there's one condition: you cannot ask my name, and you cannot ask where I'm from. I always think of, speaking of fairy tales, I always think of Rumpelstiltskin, which does not sound very romantic in relation to this piece. But that's kind of the condition of the beginning of this piece. And she is, her life is at stake, and so she says, okay, yes, no problem, I'll marry you. And Lohengrin fights for her honor and wins. And so Act 1 feels like it's very happy, and it could be a happy ending kind of story. But Act 2 begins, and we suddenly know we're in a different world. There is a kind of a foil couple to Elsa and to Lohengrin, Ortrud and Telramund, and they are kind of plotting to take over Brabant. And their way of doing that, they think, is through Elsa. I'm telling the story very traditionally, the way it's often presented. Ortrud, in a way, we see Ortrud poison Elsa's mind by saying, you really should ask him what his name is and where he's from. And then she goes, oh my gosh, you're right, I really should. And then the long story short is that in Act 3, she does ask his name in a very pointed way, and then he says, I will tell you in front of all of the people of Brabant, and he says, my name is Lohengrin, I'm a knight of the Holy Grail, and the only way that I can stay here is if nobody recognizes me. So now that you know who I am, I have to leave. And so he departs. And so the traditional reading of this opera and the traditional reading of the story is that it's the failure of the woman to not have faith, to not have the kind of faith in this hero to save the day. And it becomes about this kind of tragic loss. And anyway, that's how it's often depicted. As I think you can all tell, that's not necessarily a story that we want to be telling now, I think. That doesn't seem like it's got the message that we actually want to be putting out in the world. So it's hard to grapple with. And also this kind of patriarchal vision of a knight, the man that comes to the rescue of the poor woman, and the woman who is not thankful and ruins it for the whole rest of the community because Lohengrin has to leave. So it took a while to kind of figure out how to put a new kind of accent on it. I think in Germany there are a lot of very critical views of the character of Lohengrin. For many, many reasons, which we can get into. I think that when you look at a lot of other German productions, they tend to really go after kind of a disenchantment. They say, let's tear down these romantic ideas of what Lohengrin can be and what the story means. But I think there is something very positive about the story as soon as we switch our perspective and think about it less as Lohengrin's story and it being really about Elsa's story. And starting to think about her as the active agent throughout this piece, I think really changed a lot for me. And thinking that, in many ways, I think you can tell that Wagner wasn't that interested in Lohengrin, because if the whole conflict is about knowing the name of Lohengrin, well, he kind of ruins it by calling the opera Lohengrin. Because everyone comes into the performance knowing his name is Lohengrin. So why would he take away the central riddle of this if it wasn't to focus on something different? And I think Elsa's story started to become very interesting for me when I started thinking about how she grows over the course of this piece, and that the idea that she can be strong enough to ask the question, to actually want the knowledge, and to say, I'm not going to rely on a kind of blind faith love, but instead I want to have a love that is fully knowing, is a brave and bold thing, and is something that I think can be seen in a very positive light. And I think that that is where I tried to shift the accent towards a more politically, I don't want to call it politically correct, although I think it is politically correct, but more something that is what I think we look to fairy tales to do, which is tell us messages also about how we can make our society better, and how we can create a more just society, and through images and through relations.
One of the, this Lohengrin is based on this myth of the swan knight that's been around for about 1,000 years and has morphed many times. But when you watch this presentation, it's a shame we don't have Act 1. We were speaking yesterday about the swan, about your design for the swan. For me, some of the dynamism of what makes this production different lives in your design of the swan. Would you mind speaking of the swan?
Yeah,
I'm sorry, it's not up there.
When we started to think about the whole production, it was basically clear that we would have a problem to create a shape of a swan, which we could live further on. And at first we we thought in the direction to create a kind of burning cloud or evocation of light, and that didn't happen for technical reasons. We actually thought about to install Tesla, a Tesla generator on stage, and that the technical director turned this idea out
Yes.
quite soon. And
Yes.
It's too noisy.
too noisy and too dangerous and too expensive also. And so we developed a shape like two wings, very based on natural wings, and we tried to cover this shape with reflecting elements, so that we will have a solution close to the basic idea, to have a cloud of light, of flaming light, and sparkling, and but that didn't work, and it looked ridiculous. And I said to the technical director, we should put it into the wind channel. Is that the correct word? Wind channel?
Windkanal.
Wind canal.
Like a wind tunnel.
Wind tunnel, where airplanes
Oh. Yeah.
to make it streamlining. You know, sorry for my ridiculous English. That brings me to the point to introduce another helper. It was Jürgen Udelhofen. He creates car design and for example, Lamborghini and so. And he was very convinced by this idea. And together with him, we created kind of stealth fighter. It's a shape, I mean, it's a pity that we cannot see it.
Yeah,
here.
it looks. For me, it looked like a bomber, like a black stealth bomber, except it's white, gleaming.
Yeah.
And it's on the top of this very Fritz Lang electric tower.
Yeah.
It's a very the reason I bring it up is that we spoke before we came out here about electricity, and that we're centering the story around Elsa, but everyone in the play, or a number of characters, have wings, and they're around this electrical tower, which is. I wonder, Yuval, if you might talk about that in relation to what you were talking about earlier, about this idea of blind devotion. The fact that Elsa's sin is that she could not be blindly devoted to someone she didn't know the name of.
Yeah, I actually felt like that was the main story of the fairy tale is don't believe people blindly. It felt like a great moral for the entire story. And we have Elsa and Lohengrin in one case, but we also have the entire community of Brabant and following this king, even though I think he has very questionable motives, and the language that he uses to encourage everyone to come together to fight in this war is highly questionable. So it's a blind faith that operates not just between two people, but actually in an entire community. Felt like it's something that we could organize the whole piece around. But in relation to electricity, Lohengrin sort of offered kind of an alternative in some ways, because this, the first image in Act 1, it's as if there is this power station that no longer functions. So we're in this kind of community, the Fritz Lang-like building that he's describing is almost like a church, but it has this window with a lot of kind of almost like 1920s graphics of lightning bolts. So there is this feeling that like electricity is actually made divine in some way. And that felt to me like, first of all, it introduced us, I think, to this kind of dream world that we were all creating together of, maybe it looks like predominantly the 17th century, but it has this element of maybe it's actually almost like Planet of the Apes where they discover it was Earth all along, that there was electricity here, but it doesn't work anymore. So it can't be the 17th century, but maybe, many centuries after this humanity has gone extinct, there is this leftover relic of power, and now that's made this kind of divine object. And they are all waiting for the Messiah to arrive, the person that can bring the electricity back into this world. And while in this archaic society, of course, they go back to very archaic views of how men and women work. And the first thing we see is women being nearly burned at the stake, like an old-fashioned witch hunt. But Lohengrin arrives and basically brings back the power, which I think led Neo and Rosa to come up with the idea that, well, then he should be an electrician.
Yeah.
Yes, he comes as an electrician in this blue.
In his overall.
Yes. I think a lot of people were critical about that costume, but I loved it. I thought it was great. Yeah.
Many people seem to be disappointed because he didn't appear in a shining armor.
I know.
And with blonde, long hairs.
Right.
So.
But I liked that. I loved that idea as soon as it came up. I think your original designs were that he would have an armor, and he would look maybe a little bit more straight out of a kind of fairy tale.
Yeah. But it changed during the work together. If we work together, it changed a little bit. What needs the opera? What do you want? What we can do? That was a very good working together. It was not a work of one person, so it was a group. And this was very, very interesting. I think it makes so successful.
Yeah, I think so too.
Well, one of the things, if you go downstairs into our galleries and see some of Neo's paintings, you see a lot of sensibilities that you see in the opera. For instance, the chorus is dressed almost like they're out of Dutch portraiture, and then you have the power station, these frictions, these moments. But when I spoke to you about that, Yuval, you had a wonderful quote about opera. You said, well, that's what opera is. Opera is an unstable mix of viewpoints. I wondered if you might talk about that philosophy of opera a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's what drew me to opera. I think when I believed opera was this kind of monolithic, a piece where everything only resonated with each other in a way that created a kind of autonomy and also a hierarchy, like opera that reflects the kind of hierarchies that we're actually trying to get away from socially. That's something I have a really hard time with. But if we think about opera as a little bit more anarchic, in the sense that we have lots of different, anarchic in a friendly way, I should say, because all of these art forms need to find some kind of harmony, but they don't find harmony by being emptied out of their autonomy. We don't lose the identity of Neo and Rosa's fingerprints because I'm the director. It's instead, you can see Neo's work, you can see Rosa's work, you can see my work, you can see the conductor Christian Tielemann's work, you can see the singer's work. the ideal scenario, and that's what makes it unstable, because the easy way, the stable way, is everyone just do what I say. And that's the dictatorial model that, unfortunately, Bayreuth can be a very good purveyor of. So it felt, and with those historical ramifications, it felt very important to go to Bayreuth and offer this vision of a multi-headed creation of something that felt like it was all of our work. And it was amazing also working with the conductor Christian Thielemann and seeing him so happy about how the process went. I think people were shocked about how joyous he was during during the entire process of this, because he has a reputation for being very severe. And instead, I think he completely understood that what we were going for was something in which it was this delicate balance of all of our different sensibilities, with the trust and respect and the humility to know why we were all there, I think.
Yeah, yes, but it also have a special sound. It's different to other opera houses, and Christian Thielemann knows this very well and tell us what we have to take care. And we take care of this, and so we have also a very good sound in the opera. This is very important. If you can make the best stage design if you don't hear the singers or the music. And Bayreuth is really special. The musicians are sitting under the stage, and the musician on the stage, the singers on the stage. So it's very special, and Christian knows this very well, and we work with this, Yuval also, and so we had a wonderful music in the end.
I was just going to say, it kind of blew me away when to hear you all talking, because when we spoke yesterday, even though this feels so fresh, so new, this collaboration. So of the moment and of the time, you referred to that you thought that Wagner would be pleased that this was what Wagner meant by having people come together for these grand visions.
I do think so. I mean, I'm not sure if that's what Wagner meant, but it's what I think is the legacy of one of his central ideas, which is Gesamtkunstwerk. Basically, the total work of art is one of his kind of theoretical ideas of opera as that meeting place of all the different arts. It's actually the idea that really inspired me to want to do opera in the first place, because I said, well, if that's what opera is, I can get really excited by that. Of course, the opera I was seeing didn't feel like it was that, but nonetheless, I thought there's that potential in opera to be that emerging place. And Bayreuth was the theater that he built to really test that idea out. I think Gesamtkunstwerk for him, though, meant everything comes from my brain, and it's all unified. He wrote the texts himself. He wrote the music himself. He basically designed the theater. He was the stage director of the first Ring cycle. It was a very monolithic imagination, and I think that was really his ideal. But if we look at Gesamtkunstwerk in the 21st century, there's no reason, and actually I don't think we want it to be monolithic. I think we want it to be multidimensional, multi-voiced, a polyphony, I think, rather than a monotony.
With a monolithic expression.
Yes, I think so. Yes. But what always amazes me in opera when it works, and I do feel this is what happened with the Lohengrin, is that think of harmony as it's multiple notes that nevertheless make a beautiful sound. But it's not everyone singing C. You're singing C, E, G, and high C, and that makes the C chord. And that is kind of what I feel like we all did. Neo, Rosa, me, and Christian, everyone took a note and played with each other and worked with each other to create that kind of harmony. And I think that has a social dimension to it as well. I think the idea that we can deliver that vision. I mean, especially in the year, like when we were in Bayreuth, it was exactly when Merkel and Trump were, mostly Trump, saying, like, Germany's our enemy now. you know? And, you know, it's so amazing to then try and offer the counter program by saying, look at artists from different backgrounds that can find ways to work together and actually create something very beautiful together.
Well, before we open up to questions, behind us, we're actually getting into the end here of Act 3. Lohengrin has reemerged.
That's his electrician outfit.
There he is. And the end is, a lot of people are talking about the end, and your interpretation of the end, and especially the figure of Godfrey, who we'll see in a few minutes. This extraordinary green character, which is, I promise, is going to blow you away when he appears. The brother of Elsa, the rightful heir of Brabant. But I wondered if you might talk about the ending and how the ending evolved, because I don't want to spoil, well, I have to spoil it. Elsa is supposed to die. Elsa dies in Lohengrin. In this production, she does not die.
But everyone else does.
And I feel like we should talk about that. So let's talk about Elsa being alive with Godfrey.
We had a funny conversation about this when I first told Neo and Rosa that I thought, oh, you know what? I think at the end the entire chorus need to die and Elsa walks away. And I remember, I think you guys didn't like that idea very much at first.
Yeah.
Because I think you thought it was going to read as too negative.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But
It happens just on stage, not in reality.
no one actually died in the making of this. I will say that, you know, that's also kind of a 19th century trope in a way, that especially with the Wagner operas, that the woman dies at the end to save the man, in a way. It's the salvation of the man comes at the expense of the woman. And I think he meant that to be a positive thing, that the woman had a mission and she pays for that mission with her life. And again, I think that there's a way that we can say that the ending is positive without it being about the suffering and the death and the victimization of the woman. But instead, you know, if she is the only person that challenged the blind obedience that's required of her, then I think that she is, in a way, she has found her own liberation. In Act 1, she needed the knight to liberate her from this show trial that she was facing. But the process that she goes through is self-realization and the ability to liberate herself and not needing a hero. And I think that is very much to be rewarded and celebrated. And that's something that I felt like could happen very easily. You know, it's unusual in the piece because she barely sings at the end. She had that huge scene behind us while we were talking, and they were in the orange room. That was when she finally broke the commandment and asked for his name. And it's a big, big moment for the soprano who has to sing an enormously intense scene. And then she comes to this scene in front of all the people, and she says, really one line, which she says, I feel like I'm about to faint. And her final word is, ah. That's all she says. Ah. But the entire rest of the chorus sings "Weh," which is German for woe, or woe is us, or yeah, "Weh." Yeah.
Weh. Ach weh.
Ach, weh. No, but the chorus sings "Weh,"
Weh, and
she sings "Ach," which is weird. You can barely hear it, but you think that she's set apart, and that's why it was a beautiful idea that she would be in orange. I think that was Rosa, your idea, that she would have this orange costume, and orange is this contrary color to blue. You know, in many ways you could think, okay, well, she's being singled out now. I like to think of it as her being evolved beyond this society. And so the path should be clear for her to walk freely.
Yes, she go to the future. She make a good education. She goes.
Yeah.
It's enough.
Yes, I think so too.
Yes.
There is one of the strange things about the. Should we talk about Gottfried now? Because I think that's the.
He's not here yet.
He's not here
He's
yet.
not
He's
here
coming.
yet. It's
I'm
not
ready
here
to
yet.
time it correctly.
They sing a long time.
Yes.
It
Here's
takes
a
some
big.
time.
This is the big moment where Lohengrin reveals that his name is Lohengrin.
Unfortunately, we only have the German version, so
No,
we have
didn't
to.
get to hear that.
But he will appear soon, and then we can talk about him, or should we
Yes,
start
yeah, you
before?
can start. You can start. Tell something about the Green Man.
The Green Man appeared in one of my dreams that I had many years ago, and I saw this face covered with green
Moos, was is Moos?
Moss.
with
Moss.
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 Yeah. Totally with green vegetable stuff covered, and he had always a green, also a green hunter's hat and a green coat. And I saw him in my dream, and I decided to paint this image. And when we thought about the appearance of Gottfried, we had to search for a version that never happened before, because we didn't want to disappoint the audience. And so I remember this painting that I made many years ago, and I said, why shouldn't we put this image into the opera? And for my opinion, it works. For others, it doesn't, but because it's green, and it seems that as if it's got nothing to do with the whole opera, but and for some other critics, it's a little bit ridiculous. And it's interesting to see how it works to the audience when he appears.
Mm-hmm.
You can hear a certain sound, so nobody stays untouched.
Because the Gottfried get lost a year ago in the forest, so that's a problem.
Yeah, he became a part of the forest.
And
So maybe the audience will express its surprise again when he appears in a few
Yes.
minutes as we
Yeah.
open it up for questions.
Can I say something about
Sure,
Gottfried?
absolutely,
Because
about Gottfried.
in a way, I feel like it's become kind of, for me, the central point of the production in many ways, partially because actually a lot of people came to me and said, well, what is that green, what is that green person at the end? So it left a lot of people quite baffled. And I'll say two things about it. The first is that in many ways it feels like the perfect summary of what our working relationship was like, because I guess in a more conventional relationship between a designer and a director, you know, if I would need to quote unquote understand it. You know, I would say, well, Neo, why do you want this green character at the end of a blue piece? You know, and why is he a tree and all this kind of stuff? But I knew that with Neo and Rosa, that's not the question. The question was not why, you know, because that's too kind of rational, and it's too based on a intellectualization of this piece and the story. And in many ways, we wanted to try and the joy of opera is sometimes that irrational, and the stuff that cannot be explained, the ability to create a dream-like state on the stage, is something that I think a lot of modern audiences have a really hard time with, the unexplainable. You know,
That's how art works. That is about art,
yeah,
and it's got nothing to do with brain. It's a case of subconsciousness.
yeah,
The thing that we don't have words for,
yeah.
and So that doesn't mean it's not explainable.
Yes. Well, what I felt like it's explainable to every audience member who has their own strong reaction when they see it, as opposed to that expectation that a creative team doing an opera is giving you an essay on the meaning of this piece. You know, and we do have lots of ideas about the piece, but I think we've always looked for ways in which the meaning can get subsumed in a bigger picture that can allow each audience member to approach it like a work of art, like a painting in some ways, you know? And that felt very important to me too, to not try and then force it back into the realm of an intellectual pursuit, but say, okay, Neo and Rosa had this intuitive response to who Gottfried is. Can I make this work without needing to have a set meaning behind it? And I think that was what I tried to do throughout the piece. And it was a great experience for me too, to sort of challenge my own assumptions about where the brain comes in and when the pure, also intuitive response to things takes over. But with that, I actually, after having done it, I did kind of come to an understanding as to who Gottfried meant to me. And I'll mention it now because I think he's coming soon. We have a few minutes to kill, so I can use that time. It seemed, because he was such an irrational figure, because he was something that you couldn't explain in kind of one sentence, it felt so important to kind of end the opera with a kind of miraculous appearance, which is what happens in the piece. Gottfried returns. It turns out he was the swan all along, that another character turned him into a swan, and but we learned that at the very end, after you've completely forgotten about Gottfried, and you forget there's even a swan. That was 3 hours ago, you know? So you know, it seems like, who is still talking about Gottfried? And then he suddenly appears at the very end. So there's something actually a little bit ridiculous in the opera about this character. So the fact that, you know, so there's that element. But I'll just say that, you know, if Elsa's story is about her becoming enlightened, I think we think about that as often a disenchanting process, as the process of losing your faith in the world and realizing that the world might not be as beautiful as it might appear. And that can also be tragic, even, you know, the idea that liberation and freedom comes at a cost and is not always so pretty. Maybe that's why Elsa doesn't sing so much at the end, because she's lost the ability to speak. And that can be quite tragic, even if she's set on her own path. So this idea that at the very end we get this image of something that actually, to me, has a kind of childlike wonder about it, and a dream logic about it, and that is Elsa's brother. The idea that the two of them, that the irrational and the rational sides of ourselves are brother and sister, and that they need to be reunited if we're going to move forward in the world. That felt to me like, it's like the last image felt to me like it moved into allegory. And I thought I didn't know that that's what we were doing at the time, but now that I look back in it, I really feel like that's what it means to me. And I feel like I trusted some sort of intuitive feeling that that's what we were doing, even though I can only articulate it now 5 months after we did it. It took me a little while to figure that out. But I don't think that that's the only meaning. I mean, as Neo and Rosa just said, for them it meant something different. But I think that was the beauty of what we tried to achieve, is something that allowed for a multiplicity.
Yes, but the Green Man for us was really normal. It was much more a surprise that it was a surprise for the other people. and I also like this brother and sister going to the sun, to the light. It's a very optimistical scene. It's different to the Wagner before, to the Lohengrin before.
Definitely.
That's really new. That we really like. That was a really good idea. Maybe you can see the next opera, what's happened with Elsa and Gottfried in the next scene.
Well, could we open it up to a few minutes of questions? Does anyone have a question in the audience?
So we have to wait for.
We have to at least wait for Godfrey's.
Okay.
This is
He's coming really.
If
It
there's
takes some minutes.
Yeah.
no. Maybe he escaped.
Maybe this time he won't appear.
Yeah.
I don't know.
We have to survive another bondage scene.
Yes, it's true.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, sure, sure.
How difficult is it to change a point of view when you're kind of nailed down by the music and the words? You have to work around those, I presume.
Yes. The question was how to work around the words and music. And I like to think about it as working with the words and music, but it's true. It's actually another thing that I love about opera is that those things are fixed. I don't dictate how long things take. I can't change the words. However, through everything else, you change the accent that you place on it, and through that process, you actually, in a way, shape the meaning and change the meaning. And I wouldn't, maybe change the meaning is the wrong word. I think instead, you bring to light something that was already there, but needed to find the right moment in time. It's like as if these pieces, these classic operas, all have within them something that hasn't yet been exploded. But it's in there, and all it takes is just lighting the right fuse at the right time, and suddenly this work reveals something that it always had. And I think that's what is kind of, to me, absolutely mystifying and beautiful about some of these traditions. Is he here?
There he
There he
is.
is.
Oh,
There's the
there
green
he is.
man.
There's the green man.
I haven't seen those videos. So.
No, we haven't seen this video.
That's him releasing
And
the...
she touched him.
And she touched it. I know, that was good.
Yeah.
Kannst du noch was zur Rune sagen?
Yeah. This strange element that he's got in his hand. Yeah. It's recently I received a phone call. Katharina Wagner called me and she asked me to change the shape of this branch that he's got in his hand, because there was someone who complains about this certain shape. He discovered it as a Nazi symbol. So
Well,
yeah.
But
So
with that, now that we've all seen, I want to thank Rosa, Neo, and Yuval. Thank you very much for being with us tonight.
thank you.
And thanks to all of you for coming this evening.
Thank you.